Shut up and sit down.
Alright guys, this is Big Mech's Workshop and Paint Studio. I'm Dodge, and today's special video, it's almost an hour long, we're going to do the Lord of Contagion in a hell of a lot of detail. Sort of a big thank you to getting us to the 1,000 subscriber mark. We probably won't be doing a lot of these really long videos because the software we're using has made his take about 8 extra hours of editing. As you can see, I've done a head swap on this Lord of Contagion. It's from the Forsaken kits, and I think I've mentioned in another video that the Contagion kits, well, they fit perfectly. Sorry, the heads from the Forsaken fit perfectly in the Space Marine bodies. So I've used a black primer as always, and just for the first 2 coats of paint I'm going to be using my airbrush, and this is Skaven Blight Dinge. The reason I'm using the airbrush is just because it was unnecessary for me to sit here and glaze the whole thing when I've got an airbrush, so just the first few coats are a bit of a shortcut. Then we're going to use Storm Vermin Fur. The reason we're starting off with all these greys is because we're doing a bit of a different Death Guard theme at the moment. Me and Andy are working on the Cult of Oil and Rust, so it will stand out on the battlefield and look very, very different. If you're just using a brush for this, you just want to be bringing those highlights up to the hot points, like the points on his collar and armor plating. That's very standard stuff. The next thing they use is Lamiate Medium by Games Workshop, and Null Oil, of course. As you can see, that's starting to enrich that Storm Vermin Fur colour. This is really watered down, so we can keep in control of it, and we're going to keep going, basically painting that into the shadows and making sure it doesn't pool at this point. And we're going to be putting a lot of different filters on this armour over time, try and get it the right sort of colour. So we want a grey with a reddish hue, and that's not really a paint that you're going to see around very often. And once that's done and dried nicely, we're going to move on to the Storm Vermin Fur again. And just as this point on, it's all brushwork, so I'm going to use a wet palette, wipe off most of that paint, and the residue that's left is what I'm going to use, pulling from the shadows to the highlighted areas, and then you do a bunch of coats of that and you should get a nice smooth transition all across that armor plating. I changed up a little bit here from the Games Workshop standard of doing stuff, picking out different hot spots. Now this is Storm Vermin Fur by Games Workshop with a mix of sky grey from model colour. It's the same techniques we're going to be using most of the way through this, is just glazing. As you can see, there's barely any paint on that, and that's a Winsor Newton Series 7. Just using the residue to pull from the back to the front where the most light's going to hit. And if you keep your paint thin enough, it will dry very, very quickly because it's basically coloured water, and it'll definitely help you in that sense. The thinner your paint, the quicker it's going to dry, so you can actually get a better quality by putting thinner paints, and it'll be a bit easier. We're already 3 minutes or something into the video, and just to change things up, that's one of the reasons I did this anyway, to change things up. I threw in some Xandri dust onto the flesh colours, so you're not looking at a grey figure this entire time, because that would be really boring. The second I put on this Xandri dust onto that head, I realised the mould line that was on there was not sanded down well enough, so I will fix that later on, probably after the end of the video, because I'll be too busy doing things. I'll do something with it, and you'll probably get to see that on Facebook at some point. If you haven't joined our Facebook already, there'll be a link in the description. We're going to highlight Xandri dust, and we're going to use that with with Carrick Stone by Games Workshop, and you'll notice that's a very subtle transition if you hold the 2 paints together. So even if you're not very good at glazing or whatever, you can get away with this one quite easily. Bring in the Carrick Stone again from the shadows to the recesses, and as you can see, we're starting to build up a bit of definition there. So it looks like a bit of Swiss cheese at the moment, but he's going to get some more colour added to him. That might be an interesting concept. Cheesy looking Death Guard. Now, time to add some colour into those, and because it's such a light colour, we're going to use Carroburg Crimson with a drop of Agrax. So the reason we're putting in a drop of Agrax into this is because Carroburg Crimson on its own is a very red colour. Because they're really pale, it would take it to very pink colour very quickly and be overpowering. So there's obviously a lot of Lamier medium in here as well, but we're just going to give that a very thin coat, possibly 2 thin coats, I can't quite remember. There is a handy tip if you want to paint white over black, start with a brown. Black, brown, then to your white or off-white colour. So we're going to do this cape in Rhinox hide. Obviously the less layers of paint you're going to put on, the less lumpy it's going to look, so being able to switch from black to white, that's a pretty handy technique. I can't remember where I picked that one up, to be honest, but it seems to work really well. Now we've put the wash on the flesh and we're going to go back to Carrot Stone by Games Workshop. It's been a long day, I've been editing for like 8 hours or something. This software sucks. And again, we're going to go over the highlight areas, and you'll be able to see this more as you're painting it with the eye, because you've put in the Carrot Stone and Agrax wash, and that's going to start adding depth in there. But again, we're just going to start picking out the face details. I'm using a Winsor Newton Series 7 because I wanted to keep a lot of those details really pronounced and didn't want to flood any of it with paint. And after the Carrot Stone, we are going to use a Reclam Flesh shade, and this is extremely thin. It's basically water with a slight tint of orange, but because we're putting it onto a very pale colour, it's going to show through nicely. And we're going into the gaps, but we're mainly covering the left side of his face because that's where most of his warts and everything else are, and I wanted it to be sort of a two-face sort of thing, where he's okay on one side but the rest of his face is really distorted. This particular head has got a normal mouth on one side, it starts going all demonic on the other, so I wanted to really exaggerate that a bit. Once we've done that, I'm going to use a Reclam Flesh, really watered down. But anyone who watches our channel knows I'll use Reclam Flesh for absolutely anything I can use it for. Again, going over the nose areas, stuff like chin, etc., and the top of the forehead. And when you get a good shot of this in a minute, you'll see how this face is coming along. Don't forget to do the stomach as well, guys. I am doing the stomach with these colours. And a hint for when painting this model, don't glue the axe on till the end. I got carried away building all the stuff and cracked on, glued it on. Same thing I did with the Imhotep the Stormlord. I shouldn't have glued his cape on, but I did. Now we're going to use a drop of Reclam Flesh shade, a drop of Null oil, and a tiny bit of Drushy Violet. And what we're going to do is start painting around his eye sockets. This is to make them look a bit more red and dark, and that's going to add more depth to the face, which is quite pale. So a very hard thing to get in focus. And this is me just applying that same wash to the wounds. Not going all the way up the stomach, we're just working towards the bottom where it's going to be the most red and most sore. Yeah, 10 minutes, almost 10 minutes into the video, we've barely got any colours on yet. There's a long way to go yet. So you may as well get yourself comfy. This is going to be a long video. Now we're going to use Bugman's Glow, and that's really watered down as well, as is all the paints that we've got. Just be careful not to get it on your actual flesh tones that you've been working on, and this is what we're going to use to base all the guts and insides. It's really watered down because at the time I wanted to see whether the other tones would show through and I could have used it like a wash, which could have been done if I applied some more washes, leaving the other tones coming through. Now this is a flesh wash by Game Colour. If you haven't got this, you can always mix Tusker Fur with a tiny bit of Drushy Violet and water it down a lot. And we're going to start placing that over the underneath of the gut areas, because his gut seems to have like a layer of fat and then his intestines, so I wanted to try and leave that a bit more colourful than the rest of it. Now we're going to add a drop of Drushy Violet into that flesh wash to add a bit more of a purpley tone to it. And these washes are going on before we've really done anything. It's just that's how thin the Bugman's Glow was. I just wanted to layer it up bit by bit and let the previous Reclam flesh shades and everything show through to give a colour transition for me to work with later on. Now, because this is still the Death Guard army, I decided that one of the shoulder pads would still be a traditional it's a long day, guys. A traditional Death Guard paint scheme. So we've gone for Death World Forest, and we're only going to paint this paint scheme on the left shoulder pad, and that's going to go running through the entire army. They're all going to have that. Then Bugman's Glow was used to start picking out the intestines again. Seeing as we put 2 washers on, now when you put Bugman's Glow, as you can see, that's building up nicely on that bit of intestine. Really watered down and just gently run your brush across the front of it. The thinner you paint, the better it is. You can see how smooth that's going on. I don't ever think this bit of footage is sped up. But the other intestines with the lumps in it, you only want to highlight the lump in the centre. If your paint's watery enough, it will do the transition itself. Now we're going to add a tiny bit of dead flesh by game air into the Bugman's Glow. If you don't have dead flesh, you can use Xandri dust, small amount of that. It's just going to make the Bugman's Glow a little bit more pale. And we're going to work that onto those lumps as well, and also do the front of the intestine again. Now we're going to use the Game Colour Drushi Violet mix that we were using a minute ago, and start going into the recesses of that large intestine. I think it's the large intestine. I'm not sure. Sure, someone could tell me which type of intestine that is, but we're going to start painting that into the recesses instead of using it as a wash. Start adding even more depth to those insides. And after that, I'm going to decided it needed another highlight, so I was going to use Bugman's Glow, dead flesh, with even more dead flesh in it this time to bring it up to an even paler colour. In this instance, it's not a case of the actual skin tone being that pale. I wanted it to look like the light was hitting it. It's more of a light reflection than an actual colour choice. And as you can see, we're slowly getting somewhere with that now. Now this is Rhinox hide, about as thin as you could possibly get it, and I wanted to put that or I do put that around the very bottoms of the wound, in between the flesh and in the deepest recesses to tone it down. I wanted them to sort of be the cult of rust and oil be sort of symbiotic with machinery, and sort of carries on that whole thing of Death Guard becoming part of their armour. Now this will be Death Guard green. Again, it's all wet palette work here, and I'm showing you on my hand, where if you can see it, you know how thin that paint is. There's barely anything on that brush. We're going to start from the lower areas and bring out the parts on the armour where it's broken, because they will catch the most light. Doing the underneath just so it matches the other shoulder pad where there's a hot spot of light to it, just to add a bit more 3-dimension to the whole thing. Then we're going to use Morning Fang Brown to base coat the bone materials, and you'll find that Morning Fang Brown will be getting used a lot in this painting tutorial, because it's a nice rusty sort of orangey brown, so it really works with this paint scheme. After that, I'm going to start glazing up Xandri dust, on both sides of these horns, like multiple thin coats. You can see how thin that is there. This will give a really nice transition between the browns and the bone colour. And of course, once you've done that, oh no, I still haven't finished doing that colour yet, sorry. And once you've done that, you get a result like this, and then you're going to use Agrax Earthshade and a lot of medium, starting at the top of the horn and then pulling the wash down into the recesses of that armour. It's okay for it to pull there, just don't let it flood out of there. If it does, just use a dry brush and that will pull most of that wash out quite quickly. After that, I'm going to re-highlight the whole thing with a Xandri dust, and we're starting to get a decent transition there. I wanted the bone to look dirty rather than clean, so this is why we keep adding all these washes on, and they also work really well as filtering out any of your patchy paint work if it's not blended properly. Also going to highlight those again after that with a Shabti bone, mainly towards the tips and on those hard edges of the bone. I'm using a Winsor Newton Series 7 again, just for the control more than anything else. It's lovely for edge highlighting, and seeing as that contrasts quite a lot with the other one, this is an even more watered down mix of Agrax Earthshade and medium. And just go over it again. Now that filter will really blend the whole lot together, and your highlight should still show through nicely. Now it was time to start working on the axe, which I coated nearly the whole thing in Dryad bark. That's including all the straps and everything else, but you don't need to do the actual axe blade itself or any of those parts in this colour. Just be really careful not to get it on the flesh work that you've done. This is why I was saying it's probably best to do those separately. After the Dryad bark, we're going to use Games Workshop Steel Legion drab, and that's really watered down. It's going to take a lot of layers, but we're going to keep going over those straps. I was quite happy with the way the axe came out by the end of this. The straps are particularly clean, look decent. But again, that's lots and lots of layers of really thin Steel Legion drab. It's a good colour for any of the bandages you want to do on anything for Nurgle. Then we're going to use Carrick Stone and Steel Legion drab. The reason we're mixing the next highlight colour in is because I wanted a really smooth transition. The Carrick Stone mix sort of stays towards the top, and then as you're running out of paint you work your way towards the bottom. This will give the illusion that light's hitting the very front of the strap and running all the way along the handle. And of course it's time for some Agrax Earthshade and a lot of medium, but we're going to cover the entire thing. That's the strap and the actual handle itself. You can see how thin that is, it's barely staining it at all. You just do a couple of layers of that and work it mainly towards the underneath. After that we're going to add a drop of Army Painter Strong Tone to the Agrax medium, and I'm using a different brush, and as you can see I'm mainly painting the underside now of those straps, but it's so watered down you won't see a hard line, and they're really starting to look decent. I'll probably start doing this with a lot more of the straps, probably on some of my Orc stuff. It looks pretty good. So you're mainly painting the underneath and a little bit of the front, and it's giving the illusion that light's going across the entire thing. Then we're back to the shoulder pad, because I like to jump around on these things. That's Athonian Camo Shade and medium, which is what you'd expect on that really, and that's just going to be used to blend out any dry paint work that looks that didn't blend quite well, and it's also going to add an extra bit of depth and tone to this shoulder pad, because in comparison next to the horn with all of its detail it doesn't look quite right. Now we're going to go back over the raised areas with a Death Guard green, re-highlight those up. There's like 6 pages of colours here. After we're done with that, we're going to use what me and Andy call the toilet water mix, which is Agrax Earthshade and Athonian Camo Shade. The Agrax is going to give a little bit of a warmer hue to the green and make it look a little bit more dirty as well. And the Athonian's going to react with that and darken the recesses even further. It's pretty simple colour, it's just one drop of each, 50-50. But obviously I put a lot of medium in this. Then we're going to highlight the edges one more time, I think. It might be the last time, with Nurgling green. Just glazing those up. Yeah, that's just Nurgling green on its own, glazing up those final parts. As long as you keep all your paints really watered down and use a wet palette, you'll get some really nice results. It's just a matter of how much time are you willing to spend painting something. If you spend too long painting it, you just lose all motivation for it. I did with this model towards the end. I was really getting fed up with it. Now for some of the other metallic works. No, the only metallic works we've done so far, sorry. That will be Brass Scorpion, really watered down. 3 or 4 coats are applied to these parts because I wanted a nice vibrant colour to work with, because I'm going to stain it with a lot of things and you want the colour to show through, so you go for quite a dark colour. After that I'm going to use Games Workshop's Rune Lord Brass. Sorry, Brass Scorpion is also a Games Workshop paint if you didn't know that. But Rune Lord Brass is then used to start highlighting edges, the spikes and all those little ball joints that hold it together. You want to paint a little bit of Rune Lord Brass in between those. Just a small amount, and that's going to add depth to the whole shape. Sort of break it up so when you put a wash on it, it'll go Rune Lord Brass, Brass Scorpion, and then into like the Agrax or whatever the wash you want to put on it. But as far as washes goes, I've started liking to use Warlock Bronze, really watered down, because it's still a metallic colour and it actually stains really well. Doesn't take away the metallic look either, but it's really thin. I've been using this a lot on this model for just staining certain things, certain colours, and it gives a nice tone to the Rune Lord Brass. And the balls in the centre, I just decided I was going to paint those Warlock Bronze for now. It's a good colour, it's just a shame the pigment from Games Workshop's a bit big for the metallic range. If you've ever used airbrush paints and metallics, you'll know what I mean about, there's a huge difference. Now for the chains and spikes, for now we're just going to give them a lead belcher, because later on I'm going to add a lot of different effects to this model. Looks a bit dry and like there's not too much depth in it, but once it's finished and got an oil wash and everything else, that's when it'll really start coming together. Now I'm going to go back to the Sky Grey by Model Colour and Storm Vermin Fur to add one extra highlight. The reason for this is I'm going to put a wash on the whole thing in a minute, and I don't want to lose the highlight, so I'm bringing it up a little bit brighter so it'll definitely show through. So don't be scared to put a little bit more of the Sky Grey in there and keep it bright. And here comes the 50-50 mix of Agrax and Reckland Flesh Shade. That's because they're the cult of oil and rust, and like I said, we want a rusty, dirty reddish grey. It's really thin. You want to be careful not to overdo this. We're not really washing it as much as just painting layers of this filter onto it. And once all that's dry, it's going to give all that grey armour a nice reddish sort of hue. Just be really careful with this. I mean, I probably should have done it in a different order, but some of this I was making up as I go along, as I do. Now, Sand Yellow by Model Air was used to do his teeth, but this is a huge pain if you're trying to get it on camera and do a good paint job as well. So I just left a bit of footage in there so I could tell you what colour it was and not forget about it. Then I watered down Rhinox hide again, and basically dropped that into his mouth to start bringing out the colours. And the teeth sort of faded a little bit, but they can just be brought back out with sand yellow. But this gives his whole distorted face a real nasty look. His teeth are rotten, his face is rotting, and works really well for Death Guard, and just goes really well with this colour scheme. 1 drop of Carroburg Crimson to 2 drops of Agrax Earthshade is then used to start bringing out the rest of his face. There's a lot of Lamiate Medium in here because you don't want a hard line of colour. Like I said, I'm going to do his face is going to be much more sore on one side, so you can see me starting from the middle and pulling that wash and then feathering it into the left side of his face. I will continue to layer that up as we go. I believe this is Storm Vermin Fur again and Sky Grey. Now we've put that wash on. Ever so gently, just bringing out those other highlights. Because they've got a filter, you can use the same colour to highlight again. And that's going to add a lot more depth and make it look a lot more three-dimensional. And I do apologise when this goes out of focus. It's the smoke on that thing. Really doesn't help. And again, I'm back to Morning Fang Brown, but this time I'm doing metal in a different way. Really watered down, because there's a lot of detail in this axe. Don't want to ruin any of it, but instead of going black to silver, I wanted to start with a Morning Fang Brown and just go straight for this rust underneath all of this. One of the reasons is it would actually be easier to do than paint the whole thing a nice smooth silver. You'll see what I mean in a sec. So once that's on, we're just going to glaze Lead Belcher on, and this doesn't even have to be neat, it's really watered down. And what you're going to start to get as you build up these layers is the look of patchy bits of rust just stuck to the blade, and I just found it was a lot easier than painting it black, painting it silver, then adding the effects on. Because we're going to add washes and filters, so it doesn't even have to be too neat. We'll start working those particular colours towards the edge of the blade, where it'd be hitting things with it. I also decided that the rotary blades on the inside and the edge would be the sharpest, so we're going to start highlighting the teeth of those things just with an iron breaker. Again, that's pretty much just glazed on there, because there's going to be a bunch more filters to blend it all together. Don't end up putting blood on it, just because I didn't want to spoil the finished look when I'd done the model. I'd already put a lot of effects on it. Now for a change, I'm actually going to mix Agrax with water. The reason for this is instead of a very smooth coat, I want this to cloud, not pool. I want the wash to dry, so it has a sort of dry, scratchy effect to it. And we're going to cover the whole thing. As you can see, it's reacting really well with the Morning Fang and all the other parts. It's going to give a really old, metallic, rusty look. Now for the back parts, I didn't know what to do. This is the Cult of Oil and Rust, so instead of just doing smoke, I decided that the little balls they've got on the back would actually be some form of burning oil that gave off fumes and chemicals, so started looking up oil fires for some inspiration, and I started with German red primer. And I've never done fire before, so in fact no I haven't. I did the magma draft, but I didn't do fire on that, just a relatively similar colour scheme. Then I'm going to use my Fiston Red 50/50 with water, and all I'm really doing is washing this or glazing it into the recesses and trying to build it up so I can add an even brighter colour into the middle of that. I'd like to talk a lot about it like I've got a bunch of experience, but I've not done this before. It was a complete experiment. But just working it into the recesses, the shape itself lends to it quite well. Then we're going to use Evil Sun's Scarlet. to do the same thing, just painting smaller and smaller amounts and washing them in, because pooling in this case is sort of your friend. It's going to make a really solid colour in the centre, in the recesses, and for a change that's actually what you want. As you can see, that's starting to build up there. You've got to be sure to make sure the most hot colour is where the source of fire is from. Then we're going to use hot orange by Game Colour, and that's a much more vibrant orange, one that we don't use very often. You can see the fire effects are starting to build up there, and again, all this is really watered down paint at a wash consistency, just being pushed around. I wish I'd have given it a bit more time to dry before putting on the next layers. I sort of got a bit of a streaky thing going on with it. And then Orange Fire, surprisingly, by Game Colour. And that's going to go into the deepest recesses. That's more of an orangey yellow, or a yellow-orange. And at that point I didn't want to overdo it too much, because it starts to take away from the rest of the fig. So I thought after this I'm going to add some smoke effects to the bits that actually stick out. And the whole thing's just really watered down paint. It was easier doing it this way than I thought, but I'm not 100% happy with the results on it. I'll have to find something else to practice on. Now we're going to use Black Grey by Model Colour, but you could easily use Eshen Grey from Games Workshop and just start picking out the pointy bits. Anything that's got a weird bend and a twist to it, start at the recess of it and then start pulling the most colour to the very end. Just be careful not to overdo it and take your time with this. You need a bit more control than you do when you were doing the actual fire, but it does give the illusion that there's a fire going on there and there's smoke coming out of it. Now, it took me a while to figure out what I was going to do with this, but I decided to do the top head on the Nurgle symbol in a tusk of fur. Originally I was going to do it a metal look with a tusk of fur face coming out of it. But as you can imagine, a lot of hours have already gone into this, and I wasn't quite sure, because I'd not really decided at this point on the colour I was going to do the cloak. And surprisingly, I went for Ghost Grey by Model Colour, which is a very weird colour for Death Guard, I do know that, but the end result seems to work quite well. As you can see, that's really thin, and you can see a bit of the brown showing through, but because we've put brown on it instead of black, that's only going to take a couple of layers, and then you'll have a nice smooth coat. Now once that's on, this is a null oil with tons of medium in it. You can see how thin that is. And we're not doing a wash, we're literally just painting straight down it. If you can see the mark where you paint, do a line. If you can see the mark where that is, then join the brush up with that next mark and just go straight back down again. That way you won't get any streaking lines down your cloak, and you should get a nice filter. Now Morning Fang Brown is being used as a wash, because why not? It's such a great colour for Nurgle stuff. Mainly, it's a really thin wash, but we're mainly aiming it back towards the dints and rivets and everything in the axe. Because what I noticed once the fire was on, there was a very bright red colour to it, and everything else seemed a bit too dull. After that, I'm going to use a Cold Grey by Model Colour to start highlighting the cloak. It's a very subtle transition, and I've got my lights on like set really bright here, so you might not be able to see it very well on camera. But if you really want an in-depth cloak tutorial, just watch the Noxious Blightbringer. Can't remember how many layers of paint. I think there's like 10 different colours to get the result I wanted. And after the Cold Grey, we're going to start adding Agrax and Medium, really thin, and we're going to do the same thing we did with a null oil, and just paint it with a very thin layer of wash. Later on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a lot of rust coming off of those chains at the back, and rust streaks coming down his cloak where it's stained over time. So it's not going to end up a fully white cloak, but it's going to sort of match. And then we're going to use even more Morning Fang, because I decided I wanted to do the Nurglings so they look like they'd been running around in pipes or underground through oil pipes and other random things. So I figured they'd just be absolutely stained with rust effects and rust colours. So I started with a Morning Fang brown over, if I remember, the first colours would be a Xandri Dust. Then we're going to use XV88 by Games Workshop. Again, just glaze that on. There's no mixing here, it's just a straight up highlight. You don't have to be too neat. There's going to be a lot more washes and filters on it. Oh, this is a long video. But we're getting somewhere now, guys. And after XV88, it's time for an Agrax wash. What I want to do when this model's finished and I put it on a base is have them coming out of a big pool of oil or something. I'm going to use the Abdulung oil paints to make a oil effect. And instead of using an oil wash, just actually blob it all over them so they look like they're covered in grease and grime. And then it's back to re-highlighting with just VX88. Bringing out all the little features. There's a lot of details in these Nurglings, whereas they all used to look the same, although they are really awkward to paint at times because of the cloak and the rest of the model. Really subtle transitions here. Andy says they look like little Golgothans or something. Anyone who knows what that is will probably get a laugh out of that. And then we're going to use XV88, and of course I'm adding Rakor Flesh into it because Rakor Flesh wins every time. I want a colour that's slightly brighter than it was before. Rakor Flesh. And not quite sure where we're up to on these Nurglings, but the next few steps is basically going to be add more Rakor Flesh and add more Rakor Flesh. And my notes say to tell you guys, Rakor Flesh is awesome, keep using more of it. So this is all that is, it's just... What's that, Andy? Shut up, Andy. Well, I got to pass the time. There's a lot of footage of me just adding more Rakor Flesh to the mixture here, which I apologise for, but yeah, it's been a long day editing this video. There's a really long bit of footage of me recording, like editing that. There we go. Another step of me adding more XV88 and Rakor Flesh. So you can see the transition though, it starts to go really pale rather than a brighter colour. Gives a good effect of light hitting anything. It's a shame a lot of it isn't quite on camera properly, I do apologise for that. It's a really awkward one to paint. The such a long video, running out of things to say here. Finally guys, we're moving back on. Sorry about that. So this will be a Reclan Flesh Shade and Agrax Earth Shade with medium to just add some more depth back to it and put in a little bit more of a red hue and a bit more of a rusty colour. It's pretty watered down, you just want to pull that to the base of them. I wasn't too bothered about immense detail on these guys because they're going to get covered in oil. Now to highlight the head at the top, I started with just a Bugman's Glow. And just primarily working on the forehead and the base of the tongue, because once there's oil washers and other filters and stuff added onto it, you're not going to need too much on there. That's me trying to show you the result of the Nurglings so far. As you can see, we're getting somewhere, so hold on, we're getting close to the end of the video now. I did the bone, that's probably what I was trying to show you. Light grey by Model Air was used for the eyes on the Nurglings. I wanted some extreme high contrast there, something that would show up, especially when I put all the oil all over the rest of them. Surprised I actually got that on camera. Not the greatest footage there, but painting eyes on camera is a nightmare. Now we're going to add Juicy Violet and Null Oil into some medium and go around the eye sockets. If you get this over your light grey and the eyes, don't worry, just re-highlight the eyes with the light grey. Decided not to go with pupils on them either. It's just a lot of effort and they're not really going to need it. This is just the highlight. I think it's the only highlight you see on the horns, but I was highlighting it with Screaming Skull. It has had all the other previous highlights on it that the other bone part did, but just went up to Screaming Skull to separate them a little bit. And then Agrax Earthshade in the wet palette, because this time I was trying to keep a different type of control. I've got some really watered down Agrax in the palette and then some slightly thicker stuff. Wanted to quickly blend those together so the horn doesn't seem to have too much of a root from the head. It sort of blends okay instead of just stop-start. Now the back part, which I'd been leaving for ages, decided you could just do that whole thing in one colour, the back panel here, but with all the details that are on this at the moment, in for a penny, in for a pound, decided to break those colours up a bit using Warp Lock Bronze as the base for the centre part. And the little coils or pipe parts next to that were then done in Brass Scorpion. And just those little details, if you just spend a bit of time adding a different colour and working from that, it's going to break up bits of model and make it look more interesting. Although I knew why doing this, if I mucked it up I would just simply throw Model Mates on it, because Model Mates is awesome. Rune Lord Brass was then used to highlight the Brass Scorpion. It works kind of well, that, especially when you're going to wash it down with other random things. It leaves a good highlight there that you can still see through. Well, you can see it through the wash. Then I'm going to add Morning Fang Brown again, because I've been using this all the time. And we're going to go over the silver work. Now, the silver work was Dark Metal by Model Air, and then gone over with Lead Belcher. That was all done off camera. Now we're just using a wash of Morning Fang Brown to tint it ever so slightly. I don't need to worry too much about the depth there, because when I do an oil wash it's going to fill in all those gaps with black. Warpstone Bronze and Brass Scorpion were then mixed 50-50 to re-highlight the Warp Lock Bronze bit at the back panel. Again, every time I use this angle with the flame in the way, the camera goes out of focus. There's not much I could do about that. Now we're on to Scarlet Red by Game Air, but you could use Wazdaka Red or Mephiston Red if you wanted to paint the pipes on the axe. At this point, as you can see all these oranges and reds, the flames now don't stand out too much because we've gone for a very similar warm palette. We've got a cold palette on some of the armour and the cloak to contrast. I wasn't quite sure what to do with the little ball joint things they've got on their knees and on their decorative parts, so I decided to just highlight the centre of it again with Sky Grey by Model Colour. To be fair, you could leave it white or you could do them in the Death Guard green if you wanted to. And then we're going to use Army Painter Dark Tone instead of Null Oil. It's ever so slightly more brown, as you can see on my thumb. It's just going to tone that a slightly different colour so it doesn't all look the same. I did that on the one on his knee and the one on his shoulder, holding his cloak up. And as you can see at this point, I added a bunch more details in off camera because I decided what colours I wanted them to be. And for the warts, decided to go for beige by model colour, because I'd not really done anything on them yet, and they weren't picked out at all. As you can see, it's coming together, but it looks really good once he's had his oil wash and effects put on. There's some really small warts in there, that's why I'm using the Winsor Newton Series 7. And Carroburg Crimson, watered down, was then placed around the warts and in the underneath just to tone everything else an ever so slight colour of red. But if you remember all the stuff we did earlier, there's a lot of different colours now that show through that Carroburg Crimson with a lot of transitions. That's why you do a lot of different things before putting the filter on. It will show through ever so slightly, and it just makes it look so much better. And couldn't decide what to do with the the vent chamber in the front of his armour. And at this point, it even says in my notes, I'm just fed up. I've had enough of this model. I've been painting him for bloody ages. So it's just Morning Fang Brown on that. Took so long, and then editing's just been a nightmare today. Decided to do the pipes with a very watered down Morning Fang as well. I wish the details in them were a little bit deeper. Then I'm just going to start highlighting the Morning Fang with a tiny bit of lead belcher. And as you can see what I mean. It just goes really well with that colour when you're doing anything rusty. And what I'm going to do later is put some model mates on the side parts to this, and they're going to add a whole lot more depth and make it look even more real. I think, is that still lead belcher? Yeah, I think that's still lead belcher. And we are very nearly finished at this point. But you'll be surprised how much the model changes the second we start putting on the other things. So this is an oil wash. It's odorless artist turpentine mixed with Mig Abdelung's oil paints. And this is just straight black. And as you can see, I just tap the side of the area I want it to travel along, and the oil will just run across all the edges. This is how I add a lot more depth into the model, with a lot less work, to be honest. It's kind of easy to do, but there will be a cleanup step afterwards where you want to get a little bit of terps on your brush and clean it off. And once I've done that, I'm going to add Streaking Grime by AK Interactive, and we're going to start putting that into a bunch of the rivets and other random details, just to bring a little bit more colour into the whole thing, which is kind of the idea the whole time. And yeah, don't forget, if you're going to do this, put a gloss varnish down first, otherwise you might pull paint off your models because you're using terps and other stuff. The gloss will protect it, and it also enables the stuff to travel really well because the surface texture has been changed. As you can see, that's really starting to come along now, and I've hit that with a matte varnish, and you can see all that depth is now picked up with the oil wash. And finally, the Pierre Resistance model mates. You cannot go wrong with this stuff. You got a problem with this bit of armour here? Model mates, sorted. Don't like that bit of paint job on a Nurgle model? Model mates, sorted. And I'm basically painting that into some of the recesses and around the back end of the axe, and there you go, guys. This took ages. I'm actually relieved to be at the end of the video. I hope you like this. Don't forget to share with your friends, hit like, leave a comment, and guys, thank you so much for the 1,000 subscribers. We wish we could do more videos like this for you, but they take so long. Really, thanks for watching, guys, and thanks for supporting us. We'll catch you in the next one.